Two people retire the same year with the same $1 million. 10 years later, one is calm and traveling, never rattled by a market headline. The other is back at a part-time job, doing math at the kitchen table at midnight. Their average return was nearly identical. What split their futures apart was not luck, and it was not the stock market. It came down to whether they understood the quietest corner of finance, the one almost everyone walks straight past. Master it, and you quietly master your entire retirement. The calm one is named Lorraine. The one at the kitchen table is named Russell. They worked similar jobs, saved similar amounts, and crossed the retirement finish line within a few months of each other. On paper, they were practically twins. Same starting balance, same age, same plan to travel a little, and finally rest. For the first decade after they stopped working, though, the market did what markets always do. It went up violently, then down violently, then sideways for a while, then up again. Russell rode every single one of those moves with nearly his entire life savings exposed. When the market soared, he felt brilliant and unstoppable. When it crashed, he sold, because watching $300,000 evaporate while you no longer have a paycheck coming in is a specific kind of terror that no spreadsheet ever captures. Lorraine felt those exact same crashes in her bones. She simply never had to sell into a single one of them. And that one difference is the whole story we are about to unpack. There is a mechanism that decided their fate, and it carries a name that almost no ordinary saver ever hears spoken out loud. It is called sequence of returns risk, and it is the single most important idea in this entire video. The concept is deceptively simple once you slow down and look at it. While you are still working and adding money every month, the order of good years and bad years barely matters at all. A crash early in your career is actually a gift, because it just means you buy more shares while they are cheap and you have decades for them to recover. The moment you retire and start pulling money out instead of putting it in, that entire logic flips upside down. Now the order becomes everything. A severe market drop in your first few years of retirement forces you to sell investments while they are down, and every dollar you sell at the bottom is a dollar that is permanently gone, no longer sitting there to rebound when the market eventually heals. Let me show you how genuinely brutal this is, using clean numbers so the point cannot hide. Take two retirees, each starting with $1 million, each pulling out $60,000 a year to live on. Now hand them the exact same 10 years of market returns, the identical set of ups and downs, with only one tiny change between them. For the first retiree, the good years happen to land early, and the bad years land late. For the second retiree, that same sequence runs in reverse, so the brutal crash years hit first, while the great years arrive too late to matter. The average return across that decade was identical for both. So were the yearly withdrawals, and so were the markets they each lived through. After those 10 years, the retiree who got the good sequence still has roughly $750,000 in the account and is completely fine. The retiree who got the bad sequence first has only about $213,000 left and is sliding fast towards zero. Nothing separated them except the order the years arrived in, which not a single human being on Earth can predict or control. So here is the question that should be burning in your mind. If you cannot control the order of the years, what can you actually control? You can control one thing, and it turns out to be the thing that matters most. You can control whether you are ever forced to sell good investments at a terrible price. That, in one sentence, is the entire job of the most misunderstood asset class on the planet. That is the job of bonds. A pile of safe, boring, dependable bonds is not there to make you rich, and it was never supposed to be. It is there to make sure that when the stock market is bleeding all over the floor, You have something steady and separate to spend from, so your growth investments get left completely alone to recover in peace. Think of it this way. Your stocks are your offense, the engine that builds real wealth over decades. Your bonds are the defensive wall that keeps you from getting knocked out of the game before the second half even begins. And almost nobody ever learns how that wall is actually built, which is precisely the gap we are closing together today. Before we go any deeper, let us strip away all the mystery, because a huge amount of the fear surrounding bonds comes from people simply not knowing what one even is. A bond is a loan, and in this arrangement, you are the bank. When a government or a large company needs to raise money, they do not always walk into a bank and ask for it. Instead, they borrow it directly from regular investors by issuing bonds. When you buy a bond, you are handing over your money today in exchange for a written, legally binding promise. They agree to pay you interest at set intervals, and they agree to return your entire original amount on a specific date in the future. That is the entire transaction, beginning to end. You quietly become the lender, and they become the borrower. Every financial role you have lived under your entire adult life, the mortgage and the car loan and the credit card balance, suddenly gets flipped on its head, and for once you are the one collecting the interest instead of the one paying it. 3 simple words unlock the entire language of bonds. So let us learn them once and never feel lost again. The first word is face value, which professionals sometimes call par. That is just the amount you are promised to get back at the end, traditionally $1,000 for a single bond. The second word is the coupon, which is nothing more than the interest rate the bond pays you each year. If a $1,000 bond carries a 4% coupon, it pays you $40 every year, steady as a heartbeat, until it matures. The third word is maturity, which simply means the date you get your face value handed back to you. A 2-year bond returns your money in 2 years, while a 30-year bond returns it in 3 full decades. Boil the whole thing down, and you are left with 3 plain pieces: a loan, the interest it pays you, and the date you get paid back. Once you peel away the intimidating jargon, a bond is honestly the most straightforward deal in all of investing. Now comes the obvious question: why would anyone bother with bonds in the year 2026? The answer is that the deal right now is genuinely attractive, and that simply has not been true for most of the past 15 years. As of the middle of 2026, a 1-year United States Treasury bill pays roughly 3.75%. A 10-year Treasury note pays around 4.5%. A 30-year Treasury bond recently climbed above 5% for the first time in a very long stretch. Let me translate those percentages into real money, because that is where it lands. Lend the United States government $100,000 through a 10-year note, and it hands you about $4,500 in interest every single year. Then returns your full $100,000 at the end, all of it backed by the most reliable borrower in human history. For years, that very same loan paid almost nothing worth mentioning. Today, it pays you an actual wage just for being patient. It is worth understanding why those numbers are where they are, because the backdrop in 2026 is unusual. The Federal Reserve, the institution that steers short-term interest rates, has been holding its benchmark rate in a range of roughly 3.5% to 3.75% under its new chairman, Kevin Warsh. The central bank has grown noticeably more cautious about cutting rates, and several of its own officials have even signaled the possibility of raising them before the year is out. The reason is inflation, which we will dig into shortly. For your purposes as a saver, the practical takeaway is simple and encouraging. Interest rates being elevated is painful if you are borrowing for a house or a car, but it is a rare gift if you are the one lending money out. Because higher rates mean fatter, safer yields than retirees have been able to lock in for well over a decade. Now compare that opportunity to where an enormous number of people leave their money instead, and the contrast becomes almost painful to look at. The three biggest traditional banks in the country, the household names with a branch on practically every corner, pay around 0.01% on an ordinary savings account. Leave $100,000 sitting in one of those for a full year, and you will earn about $10. Not $10,000. $10 total. The national average savings rate across all banks sits near 0.4%, which on that same balance works out to roughly $380 for the year. A competitive online savings account pays somewhere around 4%, which comes to about $4,000. And a simple Treasury note hands you about $4,500, while also locking that rate in so that a future rate cut cannot quietly snatch it away from you. The same exact dollars produce wildly different outcomes. The only variable in the whole equation is whether somebody bothered to read the menu. There is a catch, of course, and this catch happens to be the exact thing that scares people out of bonds at the worst possible moments. So we are going to walk straight into it rather than around it. Bond prices move up and down. People assume a bond is frozen, locked, and perfectly safe, and then they glance at their account, see their bond holding has dropped in value, and quietly panic. To understand why that happens, you only need a single mental image, and it works just like a seesaw on a playground. Bond prices and interest rates always move in opposite directions. When newly issued bonds start paying higher interest, your older, lower-paying bond suddenly looks less attractive by comparison, so its market price has to fall until its effective yield matches the new reality. When newly issued bonds pay lower interest, your older, higher-paying bond suddenly looks wonderful. So buyers bid its price up. One side goes up, the other side goes down. The relationship never breaks. This exact seesaw is what blindsided millions of people in 2022, and it is deeply worth understanding because the scars from that year are still driving bad decisions right now. For years leading up to it, interest rates had been scraped along the floor near zero. Then, inflation came roaring back to life, and the Federal Reserve raised rates faster than at almost any other time in modern history. Remember the seesaw. Rates shot violently upward, which meant the prices of all the existing lower-paying bonds crashed downward. The main index that tracks the entire United States bond market fell about 13% that year, its worst calendar year on record by a wide margin. People who had been told their entire lives that bonds were the safe, sleepy part of a portfolio watched that supposedly safe part bleed red, and a huge wave of them sold in disgust, right near the bottom, which is the one single move guaranteed to convert a temporary paper dip into a permanent, unrecoverable loss. Now comes the part those panicked sellers completely missed, and it changes everything about how you should feel when you see a bond price drop. If you hold an individual bond all the way to its maturity date, the day-to-day swings in its price are pure noise that never touches you. You still collect every scheduled coupon payment along the way, and you still receive your full face value back on the maturity date exactly as promised in writing, regardless of what the price did in the meantime. The price drop only becomes a real, actual loss if something forces you to sell the bond early. So the danger in 2022 was never the bonds themselves. The real danger was owning the wrong kind of bond for your particular timeline, and then selling it under emotional pressure. That distinction, the gap between a temporary price swing and a genuine permanent loss, is the exact line that separates an investor who sleeps soundly from one who lies awake. That brings us to the gentlest giant in the entire bond universe, the family of debt issued by the United States government itself. known collectively as Treasuries. They come in three main varieties, and the names just describe how long each one lasts before it pays you back. Treasury bills are the short ones, maturing in a year or less. The medium options, called notes, run anywhere from 2 to 10 years. And the genuine long-haul instruments, the bonds themselves, stretch all the way out to 20 or 30 years. All three are backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government, which in plain practical terms means that for them to ever stop paying you, the entire American financial system would have to collapse first. That backing is exactly why they are treated around the world as the closest thing to a truly risk-free return that exists anywhere on Earth. Buying them is far easier than most people imagine, and you do not need a fancy broker or a six-figure account to start. You can purchase Treasuries directly from the government through its official online portal, often in increments as small as $100, with no fees and no middleman quietly skimming a cut off the top. You can also buy them inside almost any normal brokerage account, the very same place you might already be holding your stock funds today. And for the truly hands-off among us, there are low-cost Treasury funds that hold a whole basket of these bonds for you and simply pass the interest along. The tool exists at every conceivable level of effort and every size of wallet, which removes the very last excuse anyone could have for ignoring it completely. Speaking of funds, we need to settle one of the most common points of confusion in all of bond investing, because getting it wrong is what wrecked so many people in that crash. There is a real difference between owning an individual bond and owning a bond fund, and the difference is all about that maturity date. When you own an individual bond, you have an ironclad promise of a specific amount of money on a specific day, so you can simply hold it to the end and ignore the price entirely. A bond fund, by contrast, is a giant pool of hundreds or thousands of bonds with no single shared maturity date, which means it never matures and never hands you a guaranteed lump sum back. Its share price floats up and down with rates forever. Funds are wonderfully convenient and instantly diversified, and they are a fine choice for long-term growth money. But for the precise dollars you know you will need on a known date, an individual bond or a fund built to mature in a target year gives you a certainty that an ordinary open-ended fund simply cannot promise. You may be wondering how all of this stacks up against the safe options you already know, the certificate of deposit and the money market fund. These are close cousins of bonds, and knowing exactly when each one wins is part of mastering the whole subject. A certificate of deposit, usually just called a CD, is essentially a loan to a bank for a fixed term, and the best one-year CDs in 2026 pay around 4.25%, protected by federal deposit insurance up to $250,000. A money market fund holds ultra short-term debt and currently pays somewhere in the neighborhood of 3.5%, while letting you pull your cash out almost instantly. Both of those are genuinely useful tools with a real place in a plan. Treasuries, though, carry two quiet advantages that often tip the scales in their favor. The interest you earn on a treasury is completely exempt from state and local income tax, which can matter enormously if you happen to live somewhere with a high state tax rate. On top of that, a treasury can be sold on any business day if you truly need the money early, whereas breaking a CD before its term ends usually costs you a chunk of interest as a penalty. So the rough rule of thumb works out like this. For money you might need at a moment's notice, a money market fund or a savings account wins on pure convenience. For money you can commit for a set period and want to squeeze the most safe yield out of, a treasury or a CD usually pulls ahead, with the treasury winning outright if you live in a high tax state. A fair warning is owed here, because it would be far too easy to walk away from this video thinking the entire goal is to flee completely into bonds and never look back. That would be its own serious and surprisingly costly mistake over a long retirement. Bonds are the defensive wall, but a wall all by itself does not build any wealth. It only protects the wealth you already have. Over the long sweep of market history, a broad basket of stocks has returned somewhere around 7% a year above inflation, while safe bonds have returned considerably less than that. That gap, compounded across 20 or 30 years of retirement, is the entire difference between money that grows faster than you're spending and money that slowly erodes away beneath it. A retirement that might stretch across 3 full decades is still very much a long-term project, and it needs a growth engine running the whole time, not just during the first few years. Lean too far into bonds, and you simply trade the sharp, visible risk of a market crash for the slow, invisible risk of outliving your savings because they never grew enough to outpace your own withdrawals and steadily rising prices. The real skill lies in holding both stocks and bonds together in a ratio that matches your age, your nerves, and the number of years your money still has left to work. Bonds keep you calm enough to keep owning the stocks that actually carry you forward, and the stocks give your bonds something genuinely worth protecting. Each one quietly makes the other possible, and a retirement built on only one of them is fragile no matter which one you happen to choose. It is worth pausing on why this particular moment in 2026 is such an unusual opportunity and what to do about the uncomfortable fact that nobody truly knows where rates head next. For more than a decade after the last financial crisis, safe bonds paid so little that they were almost pointless, and a whole generation of savers quietly learned to ignore them altogether. That long, frustrating era is over for the moment. With the Federal Reserve holding rates elevated to fight inflation, you can now lock in yields on safe government debt that simply were not available for most of the past 15 years. The natural worry, of course, is timing. What if you buy bonds today and rates climb even higher tomorrow, dragging your bond prices down with them? The honest answer is that nobody, not the sharpest analyst on Wall Street, and certainly not the Federal Reserve itself, can reliably predict the next move in interest rates. So the wise move is to stop trying. You build a ladder instead, which we are about to cover in detail, because a well-built ladder quietly removes the entire need to guess. If rates rise after you buy, your next maturing rung simply gets reinvested at the new higher rate. If rates fall instead, you will be deeply grateful you locked in today's yields while you still had the chance. Trying to perfectly time your entry into bonds is the exact same losing game as trying to time the stock market. And the people who win over the long run are almost never the ones who guessed the direction correctly. They are the ones who calmly built a system that works no matter which way the guess would have gone. Let me make all of this concrete, because a strategy you cannot actually see working in your own life is just a lecture you will forget by morning. Suppose you are a few years away from retirement with $500,000 saved, and you want to start putting these ideas to work today. A reasonable starting frame, and this is an illustration rather than a prescription, might take roughly the following shape. You could set aside the first 1 to 2 years of your expected spending in a high-yield savings account or money market fund, completely liquid and ready for anything. The next slice, perhaps the following 5 years of spending, you could build into a simple Treasury ladder, buying notes that mature 1 year apart so a fresh rung lands in your hands every 12 months like clockwork. A portion of the total could flow into I-bonds and tips, guaranteeing that at least some of your money is growing faster than inflation no matter what prices decide to do. And the remainder, the money you genuinely will not touch for a decade or more, stays invested in a broad, low-cost stock fund to keep the entire plan growing underneath you. None of those exact proportions are sacred, and your own situation might sensibly call for more bonds or fewer. The point is the overall shape of the thing. Money you need soon is kept safe and reachable. Money you need much later is kept growing aggressively. And the bonds sitting in the middle form the sturdy bridge that lets you walk calmly from one side to the other without ever once being forced to sell your growth engine at a loss. Now for the single most useful technique in this entire video, the one strategy that turns a passive pile of bonds into a living, reliable income machine. It is called a bond ladder, and once you truly see how it works, you can never unsee it. Instead of dumping all of your money into one bond with one single maturity date, you deliberately spread it across several bonds that mature in different years. Imagine you have $100,000 to work with. You buy $20,000 of bonds maturing in 1 year, another $20,000 maturing in 2 years, and you continue that pattern out to 5 years, building 5 evenly spaced rungs on a ladder. Every single year, one rung matures and hands you a chunk of cash. You then either spend that cash to fund your retirement, or you reinvest it into a fresh new 5-year rung at whatever the going interest rate happens to be at that time. The reason a ladder is so quietly brilliant is that it solves 2 completely separate problems at the very same time. Because you always have a rung coming due in the near future, you are never trapped and never forced to sell anything early into a bad market. And because you are constantly reinvesting each maturing rung at current rates. You are never permanently locked into yesterday's interest rates either. If rates climb, your next reinvested rung captures that higher yield. If rates fall instead, you still have several years of higher paying rungs already locked safely in place. A retiree named Patrick built exactly this structure with the bond portion of his savings. 5 clean rungs, refreshed faithfully every year. While his neighbors agonized over every frightening market headline, Patrick simply waited for his next rung to mature and went right back out to tend his garden. His income did not so much as flinch in 2022 because his entire plan never once depended on selling something at the wrong moment. A reasonable question is probably sitting in your mind right now, which is how an ordinary person actually buys any of this. You have 3 honest doors into the bond world, and each one suits a different kind of investor. The most direct door is a government website called Treasury Direct, where you can buy Treasury bills, notes, and bonds straight from the source with no middleman and no fee in amounts as small as $100. A second door is the regular brokerage account at a firm you may already use, where Treasuries, corporate bonds, and municipal bonds all sit on the same screen as your stocks, and where building a ladder takes only a few minutes. The door most investors quietly end up choosing, though, is a bond fund or a bond exchange traded fund that holds hundreds or even thousands of individual bonds inside a single ticker. A fund hands you instant diversification and almost no maintenance, which is genuinely convenient. That convenience carries a real trade-off because a fund never actually matures the way a single bond does. So you give up the comforting promise of getting a specific sum back on a specific date. For a younger investor still building wealth, a low-cost total bond fund is usually the cleaner choice. For a retiree who wants guaranteed cash, arriving on a known schedule, owning the individual bonds directly, and letting each one mature on cue tends to feel far safer. 2 quiet wrinkles deserve a mention before we move on, because they trip up even thoughtful investors. The first one is called reinvestment risk, and it is simply the flip side of a falling rate world. When a rung of your ladder matures during a stretch of low rates, the fresh rung you buy to replace it will pay less than the old one did, and your income gently drifts downward over the years. No magic cure exists for that, only awareness, and it stands as one more reason a longer rung or two can be worth holding while rates are generous, exactly as they are at this moment. Hiding inside certain corporate and municipal bonds is a second wrinkle that carries the dull name of a call feature. A callable bond gives the company or the city that issued it the right to pay you back early, usually right after rates have dropped and they would rather borrow more cheaply somewhere else. You get your money returned, which sounds harmless enough, but you lose the lovely high yield you thought you had locked in, precisely when you can least replace it. So before reaching for a corporate bond that pays a suspiciously generous rate, read whether it can be called, and ask yourself whether that extra sliver of yield is worth handing the issuer an easy escape hatch. If this is finally making bonds make real sense for you, take a moment to subscribe, because turning the intimidating, ignored corners of money into things you can actually use in your own life is exactly what this channel does, week after week after week. Now we have to confront an enemy that even a perfect ladder of treasuries cannot fully defeat on its own. An enemy that has been growing noticeably stronger lately, and one that has quietly ruined far more comfortable retirements than any stock market crash ever has. That enemy is inflation, and in 2026, it is wide awake and stretching its legs. Through the spring of this year, consumer prices were running well above the Federal Reserve's 2% target, with the headline inflation rate up around 4% over the prior 12 months, pushed sharply higher by an energy shock tied to conflict in the Middle East. Inflation is so dangerous precisely because it is silent and patient. It does not crash your account in one terrifying afternoon the way a market panic does. It just steadily, invisibly drains away what your dollars are actually able to buy. Run the simple math at a 3% inflation rate, and the purchasing power of your money gets cut clean in half in roughly 24 years. At the 4% rate we have actually been living through, it halves in closer to 17. A retirement that needs to stretch across 30 long years can watch its real spending power get quietly gutted while the account balance on the statement still looks reassuringly deceptively large. A plain vanilla bond is genuinely exposed to this threat because its coupon payment is fixed and frozen for life. If your bond pays you 4% while inflation is also running at 4%, you are effectively running in place, treading water while the current pushes you steadily backward. So the Treasury engineered a special weapon designed for this precise fight, and it remains one of the most underused tools available to ordinary people. These are called Treasury inflation protected securities, a mouthful that everyone shortens to TIPS. The mechanism is genuinely elegant. The face value of a TIPS bond automatically rises right alongside inflation. As consumer prices climb, the bond's underlying principal climbs to match them. And because your interest is calculated on that growing principal, your actual payments grow too. You are guaranteed a return that sits above inflation, whatever inflation eventually turns out to be, which is a promise no ordinary fixed bond on earth can ever make to you. There is a second, even friendlier, inflation fighter that almost feels purpose-built for beginners, and that is the Series 1 savings bond, known affectionately and simply as the I-bond. A retiree named Vivian fell completely in love with these, and for very good reason. An I-bond pays a combined rate that is built from two separate pieces stacked together. The first piece is a fixed rate that stays locked with the bond for its entire life. The second piece is an inflation rate that resets every 6 months to track rising prices in real time. For I-bonds purchased between May and October of 2026, that combined rate works out to about 4.25%, and the fixed portion underneath it sits at 0.9%, which happens to be the highest fixed rate the Treasury has offered since the year 2007. That fixed piece matters far more than the flashy headline number, because it represents a guaranteed return above inflation, locked in and protected for as long as 30 years. I-bonds do come wrapped in a few guardrails, and they are genuinely worth knowing before you fall for them the way Vivian did. You can only buy $10,000 worth per person in each calendar year, and only through the government's official online portal. You are required to hold the bond for at least one full year, with no exceptions whatsoever. And if you choose to cash out before the 5-year mark, you forfeit the last 3 months of earned interest as a modest penalty. In exchange for accepting those limits, you receive something genuinely rare in the financial world. Your principal cannot lose value, the interest grows tax-deferred until the day you finally cash out, and the earnings are completely exempt from state and local income tax. For an emergency cushion, or for the safe, inflation-proof slice of a serious retirement plan, very few tools anywhere are this sturdy for this little ongoing effort. Once you grow comfortable lending money to the government, an entire second universe quietly opens up. One where the yields climb noticeably higher, but the homework required climbs right along with them. This is the world of corporate bonds, where instead of lending to a country, you are lending directly to a company. A large business, perhaps a major technology firm or a consumer goods giant, needs billions of dollars to build factories or fund operations or buy back its own stock, so it borrows from investors by issuing bonds, and it pays you more than the government does to compensate you for shouldering a bit more risk. In the current market, the strongest and most financially rock-solid corporations have been offering yields north of 5.5% on their bonds. That is a meaningful step up from what Treasuries pay, offered in exchange for accepting the reality that a company, unlike the United States government, can in theory eventually fail to pay you back. This is exactly where credit ratings become your single best friend, and honestly, learning to read them takes about 30 seconds of your life. Independent rating agencies grade every major bond on its likelihood of actually paying you back, using a familiar letter scale. The top tier, the bonds rated AAA on down through BBB, are collectively called investment grade, which is a polite way of saying the borrower is considered highly reliable and unlikely to stiff you. Anything that falls below that dividing line earns the colorful nickname junk, or more diplomatically, high yield. Junk bonds dangle fatter, more tempting interest rates to lure investors in, but they carry a genuinely higher chance of going bad, especially when the broader economy turns sour. For nearly anyone building a stable retirement, the sweet spot is crystal clear. Stick mostly to investment-grade bonds and learn to treat any yield that looks far too good to be true as the warning flare that it almost always turns out to be. There is one final flavor of bond that deserves its own spotlight, especially if you happen to earn a high income, and it is the one that wealthy investors quietly adore. These are municipal bonds, the debt issued by states, cities, counties, and local governments to build schools, repair roads, and fund hospitals. Their headline yields often look lower than a comparable corporate bond at first glance, and beginners frequently dismiss them for exactly that reason, which is an expensive mistake. The real magic lives in the tax treatment. The interest you earn from most municipal bonds is exempt from federal income tax entirely, and if you buy bonds issued by your own home state, the interest is often exempt from state tax as well. Consider Rosa, who sits comfortably in a high tax bracket. A municipal bond paying her a seemingly modest rate, completely free of tax, can actually beat out a higher-paying taxable bond once the tax collector finishes taking its cut from the alternative. For the right person in the right bracket, tax-free income is worth dramatically more than a bigger number that gets chipped away every April. While we are on the subject of taxes, there is a quiet, advanced move that can add up to real money over a retirement, and it costs you nothing but a little awareness. Different bonds belong in different types of accounts. The interest from regular taxable bonds, like Treasuries and corporate bonds, gets taxed as ordinary income each year, so it often makes the most sense to hold those inside a tax-sheltered retirement account, like a traditional or Roth 401k or an individual retirement account, where that interest can grow without an annual tax bill. Municipal bonds, on the other hand, are already shielded from federal tax, so burying them inside a retirement account wastes their best feature entirely, which means they belong in a regular taxable account. Matching the right bond to the right account is the kind of small, invisible decision that quietly hands you thousands of extra dollars over the decades, simply for paying attention to where things sit. So by now you understand the full menu of what is available to buy. The deeper and far more important question, the one that genuinely decides whether your retirement survives the distance, is how much of all this you should actually own and exactly when. This is where we circle back to Lorraine and Russell and where the real mastery finally lives. The classic starting point is a simple, time-tested rule of thumb. Take the number 110 and subtract your current age from it, and the rough percentage you are left with is how much of your portfolio might reasonably sit in stocks, with everything that remains going into bonds. A 40-year-old following this lands near 70% stocks. A 70-year-old lands near 40% stocks and 60% bonds. The rule is admittedly crude, and it is certainly not gospel handed down from a mountain, but it captures one essential truth perfectly. As your need to actually spend the money draws closer, your need for stability has to rise up to meet it. Modern retirement thinking has layered a sharper, more surgical idea right on top of that old rule, and it was built specifically to defeat the sequence of returns monster we met at the very beginning. It is often called the bond tent, and the image behind the name is exactly what it sounds like. In your younger working years, you hold mostly stocks because time is firmly on your side and a crash is just a discount sale on your future. As you approach the genuine danger zone, the roughly 5 years before and the 5 years after you stop working, you deliberately raise your bond allocation up to its highest peak, building the tall center pole of the tent. Then, once you have safely cleared those fragile and vulnerable early retirement years, you can actually allow your stock allocation to drift back upward again. You fortify the defensive wall at the precise moment an early crash would do the most permanent, unrecoverable damage, and you relax it once that specific danger has safely passed behind you. The most practical way to actually live this strategy out day to day and year to year is something called the bucket strategy, and it is exactly how calm retirees like Lorraine manage to sleep peacefully through market storms. You divide all of your savings into 3 separate buckets, organized purely by time. The first bucket holds 1 to 2 years of spending money, parked in cash and the very shortest, safest bonds, ready to be spent no matter what the wider market is doing on any given day. Your second bucket holds the next several years of spending needs, arranged in a steady bond ladder that keeps quietly refilling the first bucket as each rung matures. Sitting behind both of them, the third bucket holds your stocks, your long-term growth engine, which you commit to not touching for a decade or more, giving it all the time in the world to ride out any crash and fully recover. When the market plunges, you calmly spend from buckets 1 and 2, you leave bucket 3 completely untouched, and you wait. The crash quietly becomes something that merely happens on a screen rather than something that happens to your actual life. That is the exact difference between our 2 retirees, told properly now that you finally have the full language to understand it. Lorraine had carefully built her 3 buckets long before she needed them. When the market fell hard early in her retirement, she calmly spent down her cash bucket and her maturing bond rungs. never selling a single share of stock while it was down, which left her growth bucket completely free to recover its full value over the following years. Russell, by contrast, held almost everything he owned in stocks, with no real buffer of any kind. When that same crash arrived, he had nothing else to reach for, so he sold his shares at the worst possible prices just to cover his ordinary monthly bills, permanently shrinking the very engine that was supposed to carry him safely across 30 years of retirement. The two of them were never separated by intelligence, or by income, or by effort. They were separated by a wall that one of them quietly built and the other never even knew existed. Knowing all the right moves only protects you if you also learn the traps, and the bond world is lined with a handful of them that quietly wreck otherwise solid plans. The first trap, and the single most expensive of them all, is the one that swallowed Russell whole. It is panic selling during a downturn. A retiree named Glenn made this exact mistake in 2022. He watched his bond fund drop in value right alongside everything else he owned, decided that bonds had personally betrayed him, and sold his entire position near the very bottom. Had he simply gritted his teeth and held on, those same bonds would have kept faithfully paying him their interest, and would have largely recovered in price as the panic eventually faded. Selling did not protect Glenn from anything at all. Selling is the precise act that converted his temporary loss into a permanent one. The hardest and most valuable skill in all of investing is doing absolutely nothing while every nerve in your stomach is screaming at you to act. A second trap is chasing yield without ever respecting the risk attached to it. And it seduces genuinely smart people all the time. When you spot a bond paying far more than everything else around it, that extra yield is not a generous gift the market accidentally left on the table. It is the market carefully pricing in a real and serious chance that you will not actually be paid back in full. Loading up a retirement portfolio with junk bonds purely because the headline rate looks juicy is how people end up discovering credit risk at the worst imaginable moment, usually deep in a recession, exactly when those shakier borrowers start defaulting and the high yield you were promised quietly transforms into a hole in your savings. The yield is the bait dangling on the line. The risk is the hook hidden inside it. Treat any number that looks suspiciously generous as a question worth investigating, never as an answer worth celebrating. A third trap is a quieter and more technical one, and that is betting your entire stability on the very longest bonds at the wrong moment. Remember the seesaw, and remember a concept called duration, which measures how violently a bond's price reacts when interest rates change. The longer the bond, the wilder the price swing. A short-term bond barely budges at all when rates move around, while a 30-year bond can lurch dramatically up and down. If you pour your safe money into very long bonds and rates then rise against you, the resulting price drop can be severe. And if you suddenly need to sell, that severity instantly becomes your real loss. Long bonds absolutely have their place, especially for locking in a high income stream for decades, but leaning on them as your emergency stability fund is a little like storing your fire extinguisher in the one room most likely to catch fire. Always try to match the length of your bonds to the time when you will actually need the money back. The fourth trap is the simplest of them all, and also by far the most common, which is treating idle cash as if it were an actual strategy. After everything we have covered together today, leaving large sums of money sitting in a near-zero bank account can no longer be seen as a neutral, harmless, safe choice. It is a slow, guaranteed loss to inflation, merely dressed up in the costume of caution. When safe treasuries and competitive savings accounts are paying around 4% and inflation is running at roughly 4%, the money parked at 1/100% in a giant traditional bank is bleeding real purchasing power every single day completely invisibly. Doing nothing always feels safe in the moment, but in a world of steadily rising prices, parking your entire future in the lowest paying corner of the bank is honestly one of the riskiest things you can possibly do, precisely because it never once feels risky while you are doing it.
Take a step back now and really look at what you are carrying around in your head, because it is genuinely more than most people manage to gather across an entire lifetime of saving. You now understand that the raw order of market returns can quietly make or break a retirement, and that bonds exist specifically to defend you against an order you can never control. You know what a bond actually is: a simple loan in which you are finally the one earning the interest. The seesaw between prices and rates makes sense to you now, and you grasp why holding a bond to its maturity turns all those scary swings into harmless background noise. Telling a Treasury apart from a corporate bond, apart from a municipal bond, has become second nature. You can read a credit rating, build a ladder, raise a bond tent through the dangerous years, and pour your savings into 3 calm, well-ordered buckets. None of that is trivia to forget by tomorrow. That is the actual architecture of a retirement that does not have to depend on luck or hope. Everything we have covered today, though, quietly rests on top of one foundational assumption. It assumes that you already have a firm and confident grip on the layer beneath it, the way income and saving and spending and risk all fit together in the first place. Bonds are an advanced room in a large house, and that house needs a solid foundation poured before any of its rooms can safely stand. If any single part of today felt like it was balanced on ground you have not quite finished setting, that is not a weakness or a failure on your part. It is simply the very next thing worth fixing, and frankly, the most important one of all. The video here on this channel that walks through financial literacy from the ground up was made for precisely that moment. It is the true starting line of the entire journey, the place where the most costly mistakes get spotted and avoided long before they ever get a chance to happen to you. Bonds only master your retirement after the fundamentals have first mastered you. Begin there, build the base properly, and every single thing you learn today will be strong enough to hold the weight of an entire life. That is how you finally stop merely hoping for a good retirement and start quietly engineering one instead.